Hi, my name is Donald Turner,
I'm Nathan McCausland.
and we did our project on a survey of Linux distributions. So starting off, we wanted to let the listener understand exactly what Linux is. So Linux is a free and open source operating system, just like Windows or Mac, which are more commonly known. And it was created in the early 1990s by a Finnish software student named Linus. Linus, unfortunately, did not have any money, but wanted the Unix operating system to develop software that was more tailored to his needs than the other operating systems that he already had access to. But since he did not have enough money, he ended up making his own operating system called Linux. And Linux is a mix of Linus and Unix come together to make the name Linux. And Linux is very popular because it is highly customizable, secure, and free. And last but not least, the user base is friendly and helpful, which means if you ever run into issues or want to develop your own version of Linux, there's people and tutorials there to help you and actually care about it. Next slide.
All right, and then many people have the question of why would I ever use Linux over something like Windows, a more traditional operating system, especially when the argument for free Linux doesn't always make sense because a lot of computers come pre-installed with Windows for free. So the first point would be better security. And this doesn't necessarily mean that there are less viruses or anything like that for Linux. Really, the better security comes from better permission management by default. So as an example of that, users must be given permission to either read, execute, or write to a file. And by default, a user won't have permission to do those things to a file. It has to be explicitly added. And that also means that you can have different users have different permissions to different areas of a hard drive, which makes it very easy to share a system with many users. Applications must have root level access to modify system files, and they do not by default, which is very good. Whereas in Windows, if you run something as administrator, the application can modify any files it wants, and it's just a little harder to do on accident in Linux. The other thing is no Windows bloatware, for example, Cortana and Microsoft Edge. Neither of those things can be uninstalled in Windows, and unfortunately, they are installed by default. That doesn't really make sense because Cortana and Microsoft Edge aren't really essential to day-to-day use of Windows, but Microsoft just really wants them there, and that is kind of annoying. And with Linux, you wouldn't have anything like that. The other thing is the command line in Linux. The Linux is really good for just using command line. So if anyone likes text-based things, you can do literally anything in the Linux command line, including writing bash scripts. The bash scripting system is pretty robust. It has support for basic loops and conditionals and things like that. You can also pipe applications output into other applications inputs in order to write very complex scripts, which make it a very good tool to use. All right, and then going into some of the popular distributions. So on the right here, we do have a chart that is showing, this was just a survey done to see what people said, which distribution they're using. So the top one would be Arch Linux, next one would be Ubuntu, then Debian, then Fedora, then Raspbian, then Manjaro, then Antergos, then Mint, and then Gentoo. There are a bunch of distributions, but these are the most popular by a long shot.
And even though there are a lot of different distributions, they are all not unique. Most distributions are based off of others. Thus, you have the idea of branching. And there are certain distributions that have the most branches that are off of them. And high above all others is the Debian operating system. Debian, which was released in 1993, has more than 300 derivatives based off of it. This means, in essence, there's 300 different children of Debian, which are different versions of itself, tailored to those individuals or groups' needs. Next on the list is Red Hat, which comes in with the high 50s numbers of branches off of it. And Red Hat was released in 1995. So with that 2-year difference, you can really see that even though they've both been around a long time, Debian is just a more popular operating system that more people tend to want to branch off of because it's easy and they have a huge community following it. Next slide.
All right, and then this chart here is showing all of the different branches that come off of Debian, and as can be seen, there are a lot of them. This just shows that there is a very large community of users who want to modify these distributions and make their own and then release them for public use. And looking at this chart, you can see that even some of the branches have branches themselves that are actually pretty big. So the community is definitely alive and well, and there will always be the availability of features if users want them.
And so next, we're just going to introduce those 5 distributions which have the most branches off of them and talk about where they come from and what exactly makes them a little unique from the others. On the right side of each of these slides, you'll see an environment picture, which is what your base load up desktop for that operating system looks like. You will notice that a lot of them look very similar, and that's because they all want to keep the same idea of this is a user-friendly application or operating system. But starting with Debian, Debian is obviously a Linux distribution based off the Linux kernel. And Debian comes with over 50,000 packages sitting on top of that kernel. Each of these packages is managed by the Debian package manager, which works from behind the scenes to neatly organize all of these packages together. It's basically the marionette master sitting above everything, where you only see the marionette itself. And this is great because it's a completely free software and it runs seamlessly on the cloud. So this is a perfect environment for almost any user. The Debian company wanted this to be easy to use and also open source, thus all the branches that come off of it. And Debian additionally has a full team behind it that works on developing the base Linux distribution so that it is getting better and better. Next slide, please. Moving on to Red Hat. This is more of a corporate company that designed their own Linux distribution that was targeted toward the consumer market. So Red Hat is also a big corporation that has the exact same name as the operating system that they released. And to help this target the consumer better, Red Hat has released the operating system on many different architectures, including but not limited to the x86-64, the x86, and the IBM System Z. So by releasing it on all these different architectures, they made it easier to get access to and easier for the end user to modify it for their own wants on that architecture. On the other side, since Red Hat is more of a corporation, it does not allow for a free distribution of its packages that are inside of its operating system. So Red Hat has some very unique and proprietary software that they don't want others to use. Even though that's the case, they still let people have their open source software and freely redistribute it as long as they don't redistribute the packages that are their own proprietary software. Next slide, please. Now moving into Arch Linux. Arch Linux is what the tech mogul wants. They want to be able to optimize their Linux distribution in a very lightweight manner. And to do so, Arch Linux provides an Arch Linux user repository where people can modify packages, build new packages, and share them in this repository. So if Nathan created a new package for process handling that was 10% faster than the one I'm currently using, he could upload it to the Arch Linux user repository, and I could simply go download it and use it on my operating system to make my operating system more efficient by using the community, just like we mentioned why Linux is so good, because the community around it. Arch Linux is optimized for the x86-64 architecture as well, which is a more niche architecture, but it is very prevalent in today's society, all the same. Next slide, please. Ubuntu. If you've ever done anything software related, you've heard of this. Ubuntu is a household name in the Linux distribution world. It's developed by Canonical and is devoted to being a popular and widespread distribution. The widespread distribution is exactly why you've heard of it. And how do they go about spreading it so well? Well, they put it onto home PCs, tablets, phones, cloud computing devices, and servers. They wanted Ubuntu everywhere. Ubuntu is devoted to being open source, free, and helpful to the community. And so Canonical developed an Ubuntu manifesto to embody that, and here's a small quote from it. They say that software should be available free of charge, that software tools should be usable by people in their local language and despite any disabilities, and that people should have their freedom to customize and alter their software in whatever way they see fit. So Ubuntu really wants to be the people's champion. It's a free software that Canonical actively develops to help the users thrive. Next slide. So moving on, we have Android 86. So Android 86 is what you'll see on Kindle tablets and on some Android devices. And this was Google's unofficial port to have their Android devices run on Intel and AMD processors rather than the normal RISC-based ARM chips. So two developers in the Google team started this in the early 2010s. And like we just mentioned, it's unofficial. So these two developers did this on their own time, and they fully developed out this operating system. And the great thing about this operating system is that it was developed from scratch as well. So the kernel was remade, the installer was remade, the sensors was remade, and much more was also recreated. And so what this does is better allow those Google employees to have this operating system run on the AMD processor Intel chips. They had to recreate certain parts to be more optimized for those different pieces of hardware. Next slide.
All right, and then the next important thing to look at when comparing Linux distributions is the package manager. So there are many of them, but here are just a few popular ones. They are DPKG, APT, and the Pacman package manager. So with DPKG, that is the Debian default manager. It is pretty low level and it doesn't have a lot of features. It's very basic, like you pick a package, you hit install, and it installs that package alone. That means it doesn't install any dependencies or anything like that. And there is not an easy way to choose what version of things you're installing. The next thing is APT, which is built off of DPKG, and that has the ability to manage dependencies, which is very useful. So you don't have to manually hunt down all of the dependencies at the correct versions. It will do it all for you. And this is probably the most popular package manager for Debian-based systems, just because the default one is not very feature rich. And then next up, we have the Pacman package manager. This is built for Arch Linux, and as Donald mentioned, it is very easy to use. It supports upgrading and downgrading software between versions. It has built-in dependency management. And the other thing it is very easy for developers to contribute to it. They have an easy way for you to upload your own packages, and then users can easily find them and download them on their own systems. Moving on to the next part of Linux will be the job scheduler. Two common ones would be cron and anacron. So the first one is a little bit dumber than the second one. So cron runs in the background and executes tasks at specific times. And that is basically the extent of what it does. What that means is that if the OS is powered off and then powered back on, that task will not be run if the time it was supposed to run at has passed between those. And that is not ideal, especially if you really need a task to run. And that's where anacron comes in. So anacron is a little smarter about it. So if the OS is powered off and then powered back on, it will look, and instead of looking for a specific date or time, anacron runs tasks based on how long it has been since that task had run before. So after the OS is powered back on, it'll look at your current scheduled tasks and see that maybe one hasn't been run for a very long time, and it will run it for you. So that is pretty useful. And then going into a more direct comparison of a few of the popular distributions and like why would you use one over the other. First of all, Red Hat is very stable and secure. Part of the thing that contributes to this, like why it is stable, is because it has a very long release cycle. So there aren't a lot of major feature updates. And when there are, they are spaced far apart. That just gives them more time to do testing on these features, which means there's less bugs when they're actually introduced to the stable branch. So users don't have to worry about things breaking. The other thing is Red Hat has regular security updates. And part of the reason for this is Red Hat really targets enterprise consumers because they know that enterprise customers really want that security and they want that stability that they can offer. So they try to upgrade security regularly. And they actually have paid versions for enterprise customers. And what this includes is Red Hat will actually give you like some sort of technical support package, which means that anytime someone in the, like any enterprise customer needs help with something, they can actually get a human on the line to help them. With the other distributions, there isn't really a good way to get tech support like that. So Red Hat's really good for enterprise customers. The next thing would be Arch Linux. It is simple to use and very customizable. So we already talked about the package manager, how it is easy to use and very simple to like add packages to it. And then in terms of customizability, you have the desktop web browser and music player are all not installed by default. And what this means is that every user will have to configure it themselves, and they'll have to download and install one that suits their specific needs. And Arch Linux made it very easy to do that. The next one would be Debian. So Debian is very popular if you're just a regular user who just wants an operating system to use. It's simple to use, just like a lot of the other ones, but the thing that kind of makes it unique is it is updated very frequently. And that means that you can always expect new features to come up. If you really like using new things and trying new things and getting a very feature-rich operating system, Debian would be for you. The other thing is it's always free. The developers of Debian have decided that they'll never release any sort of paid update or anything like that. So for a regular user, it is great to have frequent feature updates and also know that these will always be free and this operating system will be supported for a very long time. And then moving on to the differences in kernel, this isn't really a comparison between Linux distributions. This is just in general between Linux and traditional operating systems. So there are two types of kernels. There's a monolithic kernel and a microkernel, and Linux is what is called a monolithic kernel. As an example of a microkernel would be Microsoft. Windows would be a microkernel. What this means is with a monolithic kernel, the operating system is just one large application. That means it is a single binary file, and it is really just a single process with one address space. Some of the advantages of that is it's a little bit faster because your operating system isn't a bunch of different services trying to coordinate and run everything. Instead, it's just one program. So there's just a lot less overhead in managing services and things like that. There are some disadvantages though, because everything is just one program. If any one of those services fail, the whole operating system will crash, depending on how the service failed. Whereas Windows, you know, if there's an issue with like an audio service, you might lose audio, but nothing else will really be affected. They really try to isolate components so that they are very modular and they don't depend on each other. Whereas Linux, it's all together. The other thing is that new services would not be able to be added without recompiling the whole operating system. This is just kind of a pain for developers. So if you ever have to write in a service that needs access to the kernel, like it communicates, like a program that communicates with hardware or something, you'll actually have to download the whole Linux code base and then compile that when you want to test your specific code, which is not ideal.
So just wrapping it up and concluding everything, we talked about how Linux is a great free and open source operating system. There's a great community behind it that has been developing it since the early 90s, creating many different distributions. And from all these different distributions, there's one that can fit everyone's needs. And if there's one that cannot fit your needs, well, luckily Linux allows you to modify the OS so it does fit your needs. And like you saw, there's a bunch of different key components of it, such as the job schedule, the package manager, and the kernel itself, which is still changeable, as the Android 86 has shown us when they recreated it for their new devices on the new Intel chips. And so overall, Linux is a great operating system that is perfect for any software engineer or tech mogul that doesn't want to have to put up with Windows bloat or Mac's less familiar tech user base. And that is all of our presentation. Thank you for listening.